So how did Conan the Barbarian by Robert E. Howard influence early Dungeons and Dragons? This is an Appendix N chat where I talk about how the books Gary Gygax listed in his Appendix N, big influences on D&D, how they actually influenced the development of the game. So there's a funny way in which Conan is both obviously a really big influence on D&D, you can just tell, but it's also sometimes hard to define how compared to other books. In my Three Hearts and Three Lions Appendix N chat, we talked about the fact that law versus chaos as a binary concept of good and evil, or at least order and reasonability versus madness and destruction, that comes from that book, Three Hearts and Three Lions. In the future I'll talk about the Dying Earth and the fact that the magic system in early D&D is directly taken over from the Dying Earth. But what about Conan? Well, there are specific ways in which you can draw, I think, direct influence, or very clearly you can. So, in terms of classes, character class, the most obvious one is Conan the Barbarian class, particularly in its first version. Gary made two versions. The second, in Unearthed Arcana, is not particularly popular and doesn't really function very well mechanically. But the earlier one in Dragon Magazine is quite good and interesting. And also, it's a lot like Conan in terms of it's a sort of ranger thief. That kind of barbarian hates magic. They're very able at lots of things, and they're not kind of 5th edition raging barbarians. They are more wilderness experts and incredibly tough figures. Some people also would say Conan is a sort of basis for the thief class, and to a degree, of course, Conan does sneak around and steal stuff. But he also saws through locks, and he mostly enjoys chopping people's heads off in most of the stories. He is not a classic thief. The Grey Mouser in Lankhmar is probably a more direct inspiration for the thief class. But certainly, Conan is in the mix for the thief as well. There's a question about another category, could be adventure formats, assumptions, what classic adventures might be influenced by Conan. And there certainly is that, a couple of Conan adventures very directly seem to feed into certain D&D adventures or types of adventures. Red Nails, maybe the best Conan story, involves two degenerate tribes in a city that's built under a single ceiling, so it's all tunnels inside, and they're in a civil war, and Conan goes in, he causes chaos, as you'd imagine. And though I can't think of a Gary Gygax adventure heavily drawing on that exact dynamic, two other early classics clearly do. B4, The Lost City by Tom Moldvay, and I2, Dwellers of the Forbidden City by David Zeb Cook. And I think Zeb Cook did say he was drawing on Red Nails in Forbidden City. Another Conan story, The Black Stranger, it's got an exiled count, it's got two pirate lords vying with each other, and they're vying with each other and working with each other to find some treasure. Then there's a strange mystic force in the wilderness, there are native savage tribes, they're all going into the mix together, and then Conan arrives and he causes chaos, and it's very early D&D in that sense, that factional stuff. Most of all, perhaps, Tower of the Elephant, the third Conan story, and perhaps the first story that fully captures what Conan is to become as a story, as a trope. It reads like a D&D adventure. I think that's what I'd say is maybe the most obvious thing to say about it. You read it and you think, this could be a really good session of my game. Conan is a street thief. He sneaks into a mage's tower. He has to deal with the gardens first, and then there are various obstacles and monsters. So, it's in that sense he's a thief breaking in trying to get treasure, and there are obstacles. Then there's a very strange discovery. There is an elephant man who turns out to actually be a being from across the stars, a benevolent being who has travelled to our world to observe and is now coming to the end of its days, trapped by a mage. And in fact, there's a picture here by Les Edwards of the idea he had for that creature. It's a very strange discovery. It's quite moving, actually. And this elephant makes an alliance with Conan and gives him a jewel and gives him the ability to destroy the mage's tower. So that's a very obvious direct influence on the format of the D&D adventure, what you do in a dungeon. Monsters and magic, that's another category of obvious influence. Some components of the Gary Gygax D&D world are drawn pretty directly from Conan. The cultic and eldritch tone to magic, which is so intense in Conan, even more so than in other early pulp literature. For instance, the cult cleric in B2, the evil cleric, sorry, in B2, and indeed the cultic temple in the Caves of Chaos in B2, that's definitely influenced by Conan, I think you can tell. You could also say that Lareth in T1 and even the Shrine of the Kuo-toa in D2 are also so influenced, though the Kuo-toa themselves are perhaps more Lovecraftian in influence. There's a venomous giant spider who is a dungeon protection in that story, Tower of the Elephant. Venomous giant spiders are I think they come up a couple of times. Dragons, indeed. There is a dragon, the last of the dragons in Red Nails, who has poisonous fangs. He lives in a jungle, a bit like a black dragon. You wouldn't want to say that Gary Gygax had never thought of mythical dragons and putting them into the game without Conan. And the Conan dragon is a slightly different feel, but nonetheless, it is something where you get perhaps a sense of inspiration for the black dragon, particularly from the dragon in Red Nails. One Conan monster, the Ghoul, that is a Conan monster in Hour of the Dragon, which doesn't have a dragon in it, just to confuse you. But the Ghoul is actually probably not what inspired Gary Gygax. Gary said he was inspired by Lovecraft, who also had ghouls, and probably I wonder if Howard drew on Lovecraft for the Ghoul instead. But perhaps above all these individual details is the idea of brutal and somewhat amoral, callous violence in pursuit of treasure and glory and fame and power. Perhaps that's what transfers most to some kinds of early Dungeons and Dragons. Conan has a deep sense of honour, undoubtedly, and he does good things. If it's a choice between something which Howard obviously thinks is evil versus something which Howard thinks is good, Conan will usually pick the good. But nonetheless, he's amoral by civilized standards. Wealth and power is pretty much everything to him, along with getting the girl, at least until the end of his published adventures, when perhaps just a smidgen of responsibility begins to creep in. So anytime there's an adventure in early D&D which is framed in terms of wealth and mysterious magic objects to gain power, and that you go to a location to get those things, I would say that Conan is somewhere in the background, along with Fritz Lieber's Lankmar. But perhaps Conan even more in terms of the sheer expectation of freewheeling chaos. So Dwellers of the Forbidden City, which I've mentioned, perhaps I3 Pharaoh, and certainly S4 Lost Caverns of Sojkanth all fit in. Those adventures where someone is sent off, you as the adventurers are sent to go and rob something or get stuff or make yourself wealthy. That is perhaps usually in a strange, bizarre location. That is the real influence, I think, of Conan on Dungeons and Dragons, in the early days particularly. What do you think? Have I missed something? Am I exaggerating in some way? Say in the comments. Until next time.